All right, we are now recording. And with that, I had recorded, I think, the past 3 meetings, and they are now posted on YouTube in the Kubernetes channel. However, I've only posted audio of those meetings, although I do still have video. So what I wanted to throw out to the group was that just making sure that that's okay to post video. And if you don't want video of yourself on YouTube, then maybe just keep your camera off. Otherwise, we can obviously discuss as a group whether to post video at all or just continue with the audio recordings that we have been doing so far. Are there any thoughts on that?
I think that's fine. If somebody's here and doesn't want their audio on the internet, they're in the wrong place.
Yep.
And if they don't want their video, they can turn the camera off. That sounds really reasonable to me.
All right, sounds good to me. I will, from here on out, start posting the videos of the calls.
Great.
Also, I did link on the wiki page, or the whatever we want to call it. Yeah, the wiki page for SIG Network. I also added a link to the YouTube playlist for SIG Network, as well as the agenda doc for the group.
Cool. Thanks, Dan. So I wanted to suggest that we start off with the status of host ports agenda item, because at least from my view of the world, I think there are a lot of people who are looking for that. It's something I'd like to focus on getting consensus on.
Okay. Yeah, the reason I put that on the agenda was that there was been some movement. I think Mesos posted a host port plugin hosted elsewhere, and so maybe that's something interesting to look at. But then it also seems that there's some movement on the Kubernetes side, Tim, with some of the people working on the Docker shim parts as well.
Yes. So this is Minhan. I have been working on the Docker shim, and basically the Docker shim needs some checkpointing in order to reliably create and tear down, basically reliably use CNI plugins. So I have a proposal open, and it's still in discussion. And I'm trying to put up I'm also putting up an implementation, try to hack it up together and then see what else I missed. And also, right now, since I don't have a workable CNI host port plugin, but still for the kubenet, in order for the kubenet to follow the CNI pattern, I still need to make modifications to make the kubenet to call out to another separate binary or separate logic that follows the CNI pattern, add and delete pattern to actually implement the port forwarding. Yeah, and right now the missing pieces is first the checkpointing, and then the second is making individual calls from kubenet to the host port logic, and then also manage the port opening in the CNI network plugin. And the third part is actually the CNI part, where we need to spec the behavior and what's the interface regarding the port forwarding.
Okay. From some of the issues that I'd read, it seemed like, long ago there was discussion about splitting up host port responsibility, half between the runtime and half between the CNI plugin itself. I don't know where we landed on that, but I think you were pursuing having that split. I was wondering if maybe it would be an okay idea to keep or to put most of that in CNI or into the CNI plugin for host ports, or if you'd rather keep some of that inside the runtime.
So the argument for the split was most CNI plugins are short-lived and have no long-running anything, right?
Right. And yeah, that's
in order to do host port mapping, even in the IP tables mode of host port mapping, you really want something long-lived to hold that port open so that nobody can no other process can open the port. And so the decision at the time was, yeah, we don't want to deal with that. I would be fine to make that. I mean, it is properly the CNI responsibility, right?
Yeah. So the one plugin that does not do the short-lived thing entirely is the DHCP plugin in CNI, and that kind of spawns a single process client on the first run of the DHCP plugin, and then uses RPC to send requests to that client back and forth so that the client can maintain some state and other things like that across the lifetime of the plugin run. So one thought that I had was that maybe a host port plugin could work the same sort of way. The first time that it would run, it would kind of spawn that executable and then send requests back and forth to allocate that host port and keep it open on the host side before it actually sets up container. So that might be a future enhancement there if we want to move that fully into CNI and get runtimes out of the business of this entirely.
I think if CNI does it, then then Kubernetes can't rely on it being opened. So if Kubernetes has any requirement on the port being reserved, then it should do it itself.
We don't have a requirement on it. The requirement is, or rather the semantic is, if we don't hold it open, then some other user could open it and then wonder why their program doesn't work at all, right? And so it's sort of a polite thing to do, to say, like, I'm actually consuming this port, so I'm going to consume the port for real. It would be not critical if we didn't do that, I think, but I think the right thing to do is to make the CNI driver do this. I wasn't sure what the feeling would be.
To me, it seems like something that's not really Kubernetes specific. It seems like more if you're going to do host port type functionality and port mapping, then it's kind of something you want to do regardless of what the runtime is.
Right. And you can imagine alternate implementations of host port which were like run SOCAT, right, where it would actually have the port open.
Yeah, so I think I agree that it feels like the responsibility of the CNI side of this interface. I might question where it should fit in the roadmap in terms of implementing this. So is this MVP first iteration? And kind of with that question comes, do we have a good sense of how much work this is going to be? Is this something that we can consider as a 1.6 feature, or is this a 1.7 feature?
At least for the second part of that, if the CNI plugin were to hold those ports open, that would require some of the other PRs that are currently in flight on CNI. So it might not hit 1.6, but if we want to go the limited route to start with, then it might be possible. But
so can we turn our attention to the other PRs for just a second?
Sure.
In order to get this really working, we need the checkpointing in CRI, but we also need to agree on the chaining proposal, right?
Yep.
And we need to define what the plumbing is for how do we pass those parameters down into a host port plugin.
Yeah, so we had a CNI maintainers discussion earlier this week and kind of decided on the approach for the chaining stuff, which I did update that PR and did a repush with those changes. So I think that PR right now kind of reflects the thoughts of the CNI maintainers. And the two things it does remove are pulling the IPAM stuff out into a separate block, and it also implements doing bottom-up calling of network lists. So the reason for the IPAM change was that it wouldn't interact as well with DHCP at the moment, but it's also something that we think we can do backwards compatibly in the future. As in, we start with this, we start with embedded IPAM in the network blocks, and then we could at some future point pull the IPAM plugins out into their own separate blocks, top level, fairly easily, I think. So we figured start small, get larger, but I think that this will work for most cases right now. So if you want to take another look at that, Tim and anybody else, and just make sure that that seems to be going in the right direction. I think we've got buy-in from most of the CNI maintainers on how that should work.
All right, I will reread that PR. So that would give us the ability to run multiple plugins in sequence.
Yep.
how about the passing of host ports into CNI? Like, my feeling is we're basically codifying host ports as part of the CNI feature set. And so we should just add an nvar or something that is the host port mapping that we expect.
I would say that we are making it part of the reference implementation of CNI plugins, not so much the spec, just to make sure that that's clear.
I'm not sure that we are even saying that. Like, it's not clear to me that host ports need to be part of the CNI spec.
I was thinking in terms of the same way that you know, like the host local plugin is not really part of the CNI spec, and some of its special fields are not part of the CNI spec.
Right. So at the moment we have in the official CNI plugins, the ones that exist in that repo, there is exactly one special field. And I'm not sure that's actually even in the spec, or it's just in the host local documentation to say there is this one field to set the IP. I think that's the only kind of precedent we have for this kind of thing. And yeah, we definitely need to check whether that's in the spec.
But there's a difference between the special fields that are in the JSON, which are interpreted on a per plugin basis, and the parameters that are passed from the runtime to the plugin on the exec, which are passed in environment variables and are effectively standardized, right? There's a bunch of CNI with our stuff.
Yeah, I think
there's a very limited set of those things, though, and I'm not sure that host ports obviously falls into that set. But there's an extension mechanism in the args in the environment fields, which is this args parameter. But there's also a corresponding args field in the network config JSON, which can be used as well.
So if we use the args field, we can define, write a pseudo specification that is, find an arg called host ports and interpret the string thusly. But isn't that just writing part of the spec then? It's not
no. So I don't think that is something that falls into the CNI spec as it's written. Right. I think that's something that there happens to be one field like that at the moment, which is the IP field, which can be an arg for the one plugin, the host local plugin. And so that has become a kind of convention, and we can try and establish a similar convention for plugins that are going to do host port setup. I think it's quite a big change to then make that part of the spec.
Yeah.
A big departure from the current position.
I mean, we'd also talked in the CNI maintainers meeting about having it be an actual part of the JSON for that plugin.
But so I read that was part of the original chaining proposal, but I don't think the port mapping stuff belongs in the JSON. I think it's very much a per instance parameter, not a per network parameter.
Yes, but that said, I think a lot of the parameters for some plugins, even like the tuning plugin, for example, are not necessarily per network, but might be per pod. I mean, something that are, like you said, instance variables.
All right, we don't need to do it here. Let's take it to
right.
Is there a separate PR for this topic, or is it part of the chaining PR?
Currently, it's part of the chaining PR, but we should create a separate issue for the topic of host ports specifically, because at some point, if we're going to add some kind of host port plugin through CNI, and we want to track that.
Okay, Dan, you're fading out a little bit there. We'll take it to the chaining PR, and we'll fork off a new PR to have that. I would like to make a goal of next time we convene that this stuff is agreed to and merged. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to note that it's not necessarily a PR that we need here. Like, it's not clear to me that actually anything needs to change on the CNI side for it. So I think we should fork it off into a separate issue to discuss it, yes. But having a goal of a PR isn't necessarily right.
Yep, fair enough. All right, next topic, Casey.
Can I just double check? I didn't quite follow everything that Minna was saying on the plan on the Kubernetes side. So as I understand it, we're we have this CRI thing and the Docker shim sitting behind CRI, and the Docker shim is using CNI to do its networking. Minna, you also mentioned KubeNet. Are you saying that you're intending to enhance the current KubeNet that's not using CRI in order to call these chained plugins and do the host port stuff through whatever mechanism we choose to use for the CRI side of things?
Yes, that's at least for the 1.6. That's maybe be a plan.
And so what about the CNI driver in the kubelet? Is that expected to change at all?
Yes, we also expected to change it, and then like I said, if we try to pursue the split approach, so the CNI network has to hold.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that. You're breaking up a little bit.
So if we like decided to go with the split approach, basically kubelet will hold, or Docker shim will hold the port, and CNI plugin will actually do the mapping. Then we need to make corresponding changes to the CNI network plugin to make it hold a port. And then, and also the plumbing, and also pass down the port mapping.
Yeah, so I think that's the bit I'm asking about specifically, not holding the port open, but how we choose to invoke the plugins over the CNI interface.
So whatever ARG we agree on, that is how you specify which ports to map, we will support that in both CNI and KubeNet.
And so, I mean, this is probably just showing that I don't fully understand the CRI plans. So me as a user using the kubelet, in 1.6, I'll have a choice of using CRI or using the existing thing that there is at the moment, right?
Yes.
And we're saying that this host port mechanism with the information passed over the CNI interface, as a user, I should be able to use that whether I'm using CRI or not.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. That's good.
Right. So the next thing on the list is the network policy discussion. Shall we start with this thread that's been on the mailing list about the service VIP implementation, Tim?
Yeah. So I think that this is a real valid issue. Should I recap the issue, or does everybody feel like they read the thread? Just one person say they need me to recap it, and I'll do it.
You might as well just do a 30-second recap anyway.
Oh. There exist or will or could exist implementations of services and service VIPs where the packets actually arrive at the destination machine with the VIP intact. And the network policy API as currently spec'd lists the subject of the policy as a pod selector. So the obvious thing to do, and I'm using quotey fingers around obvious, the obvious thing to do would be to take that pod selector, expand it to a set of pods, extract the IP addresses, and write some firewall rules based on those IP addresses. If the service VIP is intact, that will not match any of those pod IP addresses. And as such, network policy will not work correctly with that services implementation. And I think that this is a valid services implementation, and I guess maybe that's up for debate, but I feel like it's valid. And as such, we need to think hard about what the right answer is with respect to network policy. Like, I feel like we might need an API change.
So the way I have kind of thought about this briefly is that there isn't a requirement that all network policy implementations work with all service implementations or any CNI implementation. And there's nothing fundamentally about the spec that would prevent this this service implementation you're talking about from working with network policy. It's just that the way people have implemented it today might not.
Well, there was a really good counter to that, which was brought up, which said, given a pod selector, I can't actually figure out all of the IP addresses that I'm supposed to allow into this machine without accidentally opening the door to other services, right? If you have pods services that are superset selected, you can end up opening those pods when you didn't mean to.
Give me a second to digest that. Was that a comment in the?
The last email in the thread this morning was actually a really great example of it. It was very straightforward. Maybe you can read it out. I don't have my screen up here.
Yeah, I don't think I've checked that since this morning.
I also wanted to bring up the point that there's another services implementation that I think we have to support.
Please.
Which is some sort of user-level proxy and load balancer. So the packets arrive with client equals the load balancer, not the original client.
That is an even bigger challenge.
So, and also kind of related to this, in the validation bug that I filed yesterday, I realized that if you have a string as the port for a network policy, that's supposed to be matched against container port definitions on the pods, meaning each pod in the namespace could be accepting the same policy on a different port. Turns out, as far as I can tell, nobody implements this. I looked at all of the implementations that are in GitHub, and none of them do. But maybe if the policy just specified the service that it was trying to re-implement rather than, and then people could match going into the service IP address rather than going into the pod IP address, that would certainly make things simpler for us, and would also solve the problem that you're talking about.
Well, it would solve my problem. I don't think it would solve Mike's problem.
You would have to match the traffic going both into and out of the. Yeah. So in OpenShift's current multi-tenant stuff, pre-network policy, we do all of the policy checking going into services and then assume that everything coming out of kube proxy has already been validated, and so can just be accepted. There's some issues with that too, but.
Oh, okay. I see what you're saying.
So I didn't yet find the comment about supersetting being a problem. Can someone help me find it?
Maybe they only sent it to me. Hold on 1 second.
Yeah, I also don't see that.
Oh yeah, Salvatore only sent it to me. I'm sorry. The example was, let me read it out. Come on, Gmail. All right, here's an example. So you have pod A, which has an address A, and it has labels, label 1, label 2, right? And you have pod B, which has only label 1. And I have a service which is based on label 1. So the network policy which selects pods for the network policy selects label 2. In order to do the pod selector, we have to then go up to the services and say, show me all of the services that include this pod, which would include both pods A and B. Would include service S, which would include pods A and B, which we would then end up opening the network policy for pod B, even though it was only supposed to be open for pod A.
Well, slow down. I'm not quite sure I follow the whole picture.
Forward this to the group. I'm not going to.
I mean, I understand certainly that a service may have more endpoints than a certain policy applies to, but I thought you were talking in this thread about an implementation that is still filtering adjacent to each pod. So for each pod, you can say, what are the relevant services for this pod? and include their VIPs in the allowable destination addresses?
If you let me parse that sentence. It's complicated enough that the picture has to form in my head. If you have essentially a firewall allow on the VIP, right? Then you can
yeah, I guess I don't actually understand this implementation well enough. So this is one where the packet gets all the way to the pod with destination equals the VIP.
Yes.
What makes it actually get through the host's network namespace specifically to the right pod?
You can set up, I presume that it involves setting up equal cost routes, like load balance routes on the node.
So so that's doing some of the load balancing.
It would be doing load balancing within the node. So if the packet arrived at a VM, it would have to decide between the backends on that VM. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Okay, that would be a problem.
And so let me just forward this message. I'm not sure. Maybe we shouldn't resolve it here because we're going to run out of time. But let me type. Sorry. All right, I sent it. I hope that wasn't offensive. We don't need to solve it here, but I do think we need to think about what, if any, API changes we can make. So going back to changing, instead of a pod selector, having it be a service name or a service local object ref would be, I think, clearer. And the existing implementations would have a relatively simple transformation to make it work. It would mean that if you wanted to apply policy to an arbitrary set of pods, you'd have to create a service first. Or we could just do, again, another one of and say, well, like the subject of your policy is either a service or a pod selector, which then makes sort of everybody a little bit more complicated.
Well, I would like to argue that maybe that's the right solution, based on analogy to the way things have been working for the previous very long time. Right? I mean, in a lot of the world, there are, for example, user-level proxies and load balancers. People write firewall rules knowing that packets are going, that treat explicitly the case of packet going to service and packet going to backend differently. And people can live with that. It maps fairly directly to implementations. Might actually be the best solution.
To just allow pod selector or service?
Or service selector, even if you, the spirit of what we're doing, it would be a service selector. But yeah.
But then, what if somebody's using the proxy implementation that leaves the VIP in the and your policy uses a pod selector? Are you expected to magically make it work, or? No,
I think at that point you do the obvious thing. If you specify a pod selector, you're allowing traffic from those pods. If you can do better than that, like, bully for you, but I think it's not reasonable to expect it to magically work in all implementations. If you wanted to apply policy to a service, you have to specify the service. And actually, I would say the vast majority of cases, people should be specifying services.
And it doesn't really matter now, but we definitely want that if we get around to egress network policy as well. There were like even stronger use cases for having service selectors there. So.
Careful, actually. Now, and this kind of came up in the mailing thread. For egress filtering, I'm really nervous about equating a service with the anything. Right? Services are really an ingress sort of construct in Kubernetes.
No, but the idea, I know that these pods are going to connect to this specific service, and so that egress traffic should be allowed.
Yeah, in terms of the destination side. Right. On that other question, the previous one, I think we ought to allow the source to be independent of the implementation. So, that not necessarily disagreement, but I want to be really clear, right? It is a challenge, because if you want the source to be independent of the implementation, it needs to work reasonably for all the implementations.
I'm sorry, I lost track of what that one meant. The source of...
I'm sorry, the network policies that a user writes, the
Yes.
user shouldn't have to know which implementation is used in the cluster in order to write correct set of network policies.
That's true. I buy that.
If they want to accept connections either to the service IP address or directly to the pod IP address, then they can just specify two different network policies, one allowing to the service and one allowing to the pods. And if they don't, then they just specify one or the other.
Well, again, I look at it again. First off, we have to define the semantics of the input to the API. So so the question there is, if you write some policies that apply to a service, say you write a policy that applies to a service and another policy that applies to some pods, are they combined with and or? We define that in terms of the source.
Network policy is always or. I mean, you're always adding more allows to the default deny base, right? So
that's the answer I would recommend. I'm glad to see you assumed it without even thinking there was a question. Now we get to the implementation. If it's an or, the implication is that if a user creates a network policy that only speaks to the pod, that only one policy that addresses the pods and not the service, then that tells me that my interpretation, maybe I'm just down one rut. My interpretation would be that if the sender sends a packet with destination equals pod address, that would be allowed. And if the sender sends a packet with destination equals service VIP, it would not be allowed. Which is a property that our current implementation, combined with kube proxy, is impossible to implement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is actually, the reason for which a few months ago, this is one of the reasons for which we decided to not include services in network policies. We did this exact discussion a few months ago.
Right.
So I was going to argue with that, but Tim was saying before that maybe we should move on because we still have so maybe just move this back to the mailing list?
Yeah, these are really good conversations that I think mailing list captures better than a video recording. So I would love to take this back to the mailing list, but I do think we need to come up with an answer to this, and I think this may impact the decision whether or not to move network policy to GA in 1.6. If we're going to make an API change, we should consider letting it sit for one more cycle. If for no other reason than to let the implementations catch up. Okay. Next topic.
Yeah, so I guess we will not talk about the other network policy stuff just yet, because I know, Dan Winship, you had some other questions.
Yeah, if there are questions on the PR, people who have implemented network policy should look at them and respond.
Yep.
Okay.
Which PR are we talking about now?
It's linked in the agenda doc, 39164.
This is the one about moving network policy to V1 for 1.6, which we may not be doing.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay. Do you want to talk about the ingress stuff and leave docs for last?
Sure.
All right.
Hi, folks. This is Louis. So I don't know how many people on the call actually had a chance to read the ingress docs. There were comments from a few folks, but they would what we describe as the usual suspects. So I was wondering if, first of all, if there was any feedback from people on the call about the doc. Do people generally accept the premise, if not necessarily the expression?
I'm afraid I haven't had a chance to give it a good look yet.
Yeah, me neither. Can you put a link in here?
Sure. I'll get the link while you go ahead and talk.
So if nobody's, I mean, I know some of this happened over the holidays, although the doc was sent out a reasonable time before the holidays, I think. I do have a meta question about audience. The SIG network meetings are generally quite focused on L3 stuff and below. I was wondering if, there's a number of different topics that I've sent out to the group recently, some which have engendered more conversation than others, whether this is in fact the right audience or for this subject. I'm pretty sure there are plenty of people out there who care a lot about this stuff. I'm just not sure that either they're aware that this forum exists or that we're not finding a way to bring them to the table.
Yeah, where are all the ingress people? That's a rhetorical question, I guess. They're not here to answer.
I mean, we've got a few at Red Hat on the OpenShift team who do not typically attend these calls because we haven't discussed anything ingress related in the past. So we could rope some of them into these.
I think that would be really useful because I mean, we have been very focused on the lower end of the stack. And there's, I think, significant work to do. And I know Louis and his team here have been trying to get some community buy-in on some ideas. And I'm as guilty as anybody, but we haven't been real responsive in terms of getting meaningful feedback, which I guess one could argue is tacit approval to do whatever the heck you want, but not really.
Right. I mean, I don't feel like going and shooting all the buffalo. So, absent any feedback, it will remain in stasis. And anything interesting that anybody's going to do will happen in third-party resource or in annotation, effectively, which is not necessarily ideal, given at least what I think the real use cases are. Maybe I'm not covering people's real use cases, but I have some experience in this area. So I would really love feedback, and if you have people you can poke, please poke them, because stasis is not necessarily a good outcome.
Look, I agree with you. I think this group should not be limited to layer 3 and below. I have to apologize. I know before the break I was asked to look at something and I've forgotten what it is now. So I'm probably guilty too. Yeah. So I'm fully in favor of reinvigorating our attention to higher levels.
Okay, I'm looking for the doc thread right now so I can pop it to the top. I'm trying to remember what the subject of it was.
There is an original one that was on December 19th, proposal for better ingress routing, and then there was another thread that showed up this week called proposal for better ingress routing alternative expression. I put a link to the first one from Lewis in the doc, the agenda doc, but not the second one because his name wasn't attached.
You want to just pop the thread, like just ping the threads and pop them to the top?
Yeah, I can do that. I mean, that second alternate proposal, right, is effectively pinging it back to the top because it's just a variation.
Okay.
And the author of it, Martin, Ali, and I had talked about it a couple of times. And, it's just a different expression of the same thing in some sense, although, I don't necessarily agree with some of the expression in Martin's document, but in spirit they're the same, and he would be quite happy if one or other of the solutions came to fruition.
Okay.
But I'm happy to ping the original one.
Yeah, please just pop them to the top of the thread, and everybody look in the mailing list for these threads and try to make a little time. They're actually not that bad to read. And see if we can get some feedback. Or if you're in an org like Red Hat where you have people who are probably interested in it, but it's not you, poke those people and see if they're interested in starting to attend this, or at least monitor the agenda so that they can figure out week by week if they're willing to attend.
Yep. I will try to forward that along internally to our organization.
Yeah, I mean, if people are interested, I'm more than happy to have direct, like, video chats about this stuff. If there's a smaller community, that's more than fine.
Yeah, it may make sense to peel off the people who are interested in this topic and form a smaller working group, and give them the authority to make some design decisions.
But I think we should start by talking about it here and then peel off if necessary.
Okay, well, let's make an active effort to try to talk about it at the next session then. This being like the third such attempt. Let's make the next one the last one, or the first one, however you want to view it. So what's left on our agenda? Is it just docs?
Multiple networks, although Joji's not here. I guess I can kind of spend 2 minutes talking about that.
Sure, go for
it. Basically, are we at the point where we need to start defining that? That was the gist of what I was going into Joji in a reply at one point. Telling him to basically just start a proposal for a network object, kind of in the same way that we did network policy, and then see where it goes and see what people thought. I know you've mentioned a couple times, Tim, that maybe we need to get to that point, and my question is now that point, and would a proposal for discussion be well received by the group?
So I read over Joji's doc. I had a bunch of questions, and that was before Christmas. I haven't actually circled back since then.
Me either.
I mean, I feel like this is inevitable in some sense. I don't feel some built-up pressure to do it right now, but if somebody has the need to scratch this itch, then this is what open source is about, right? We shouldn't get in their way in order to scratch the itch. So
I've lost track again of Joji's talk. Could someone again put it in the agenda, pointer to it? I'd like to look at it. I have an itch to deal with the case of a pod connected to single pod connected to 2 networks.
That's it.
And
that's this problem.
Yep.
Okay. I'd like to see work on that.
Okay.
So
in the archive, if you go to Google Groups, it should be in the archive. Search for Joji. He doesn't write that much.
Also, Rajat's on the call, and he had asked in the chat if we were going to talk about that today. Rajat, if you have any further thoughts on that, or like Tim said, if ZTE wants to get involved here and start helping to drive that forward, that would be a great contribution for them.
Yeah, this is Rajat now. I've been getting involved with some of the real use cases on the field on how things have been working with network policy objects and everything what this SIG has been producing. So I come back and join this group a little bit again and try to bring in some of the use cases, real use cases. And I have Lee from ZTE who has joined this call also, and he promises that he'll join the next few ones also. And they're very, very keen on getting this multiple networks thing going on. So I had a big discussion, and then we really feel that this needs to be, this needs to be happening now. The case is very simple. We need not just a pod to be able to have multiple network interfaces in it, but those interfaces be able to join different networks. And then they have, as a telco use case, have different requirements from those networks. And those networks may have their own network policy objects, and things get complicated. Now, my first question, and I would probably should have taken more time to go through Joji's document, is the implication on services. Now, as services as they stand today, they just pick up the endpoint that is available in the status and everything, and that's how our kube proxies respond to it. And if there's a kube proxy which is custom implemented, that's how it responds to it. But what we want is, in this particular use case, probably 3 to 4 networks, and the service that gets created, any service that is created, be able to specify that I am a service which wants to address a particular network, and that network is not predefined in the cluster. It's more like through CNI. So we're talking a little bit of mess. I don't know if anyone else has thought through this, but these are kind of the requirements, and I can specify, or maybe I can write up a use case document on saying, how will you solve that case? Any thoughts starting the discussion?
I think injecting more use cases into it would be useful.
Yeah, that sounds particularly complicated. I hadn't considered the services in multiple networks being distinct from each other case. Like, can I ask for one clarification, Rajat?
Yeah.
You said the network interfaces be able to join multiple networks. Do you see the need for sort of dynamically joining a pod to networks like Docker does allow, or is it sufficient to statically define that?
No, so far it is at birth and saying, I want 3 interfaces, and each interface has a one-to-one mapping to each network. Okay. And maybe the order is important and maybe the order is not, but that kind of only depends on how we figure out the services. Now, when I create a service, how do I specify that my endpoints are going to be, that second network or the second interface in some way, or the third one? Right? We have no way of specifying, or even my mind is kind of muddy right now how to solve that problem.
Yeah, I think CNI plugin chaining can help a little bit here, because one of the problems we had before was that, even if you did have multiple CNI config files or CNI network files, it wasn't, well, 2 things. First, how do you know which CNI network files get applied to which pod? And then second, only one CNI network file could theoretically get applied to a pod, and the ordering was not defined. But if we have chaining, you could technically specify this particular chain gets applied to a pod, and that chain can include a whole bunch of things.
Totally agree. I mean,
might help.
In this complicated problem, that is probably a low hanger. I looked at the PR that you had for the chaining, and that looks reasonable to me. I mean, there may be few side cases and corner cases where we don't know what the order is, and I think pointed that out also. But that is not a big problem. Big problem comes on your controller side, where we have an inbuilt controller which is looking at these pods, doing this pod selector from the service, and then populating endpoints, and it's just picking up the first IP address that it ever imagines and stuff, and then probably gotten from. There are a whole lot of use cases where you say, how do I even specify which is my endpoint? And I have 3 interfaces, not just because I like number 1, number 2, number 3, but they have different meanings. One is probably a data control network. And if I create a service, which actually is supposed to be a management layer network kind of a service, then it needs to pick up that particular network, and that particular interface needs to be addressed in those endpoints. Where do all these controllers will live? Are we going to modify the existing service controller with some new feeds? Or are we going to have multiple controllers where you specify a service and say, by the way, go and attach to that network, and only that particular controller will be activated because that controller is meant for that network? I don't know what the answer is, but I mean, I have a lot of solutions. I don't know what the right answer is. And then,
Rajat,
let me stop you there. You clearly have put some thought into it already. Can we get you to review Joji's doc and start working with him to sound out those use cases? Because I think you've made it much more complicated. I mean, in a good way. And so we should start to work out the details of those. I don't think it's impossible to solve. I do still think it's inevitable. So let's just do it.
I can forward you the link to the doc if you can't find it, Rajat.
No, I have it. It's just that I haven't reviewed it lately. I looked at it once it was posted, but I'll look at it again. And I get the ZTE folks. I'm kind of representing them right now, but they should get more active and provide the real from the battleground kind of cases.
Okay. And as this gets to a place where it's ready for more review, maybe we should just dedicate a whole session to digging deep into that.
Wonderful, thanks.
So, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So we solve it in a slightly different way. Very similar use case. What Rajat is asking. So what we define is we have a template where we define the port tuple. Okay. That's where we define like 2 or 3 interfaces of ports which are associated with a given pod. And then we specify a service template. We specify what kind of service it is, right? And as the pod or a VM or depending upon what kind of deployment it is, right, that gets deployed, that port tuple gets associated with it, and port tuple specifies that there is a service instance of this service template which we're utilizing, right? And that is how, because the service, the port tuple has 3 or 2, depending upon management interface, left, right network, whichever networks you're associated with. So that's how the association is one-to-one created, and hence the services are deployed. So this is how we are deploying. In fact, we'll probably be giving you a demo within a month or so. Where this is how we are dealing with multiple networks, multiple ports, multiple services, and chaining them all together to come up with a solution. So I have not looked at Joji's document either myself, but I intend to review it, and I can work with you offline, and we can possibly discuss these use cases and figure it out.
That sounds great. Maybe you can write up what you're doing too in that thread.
Yes,
Okay.
I will look at it. Yeah.
Cool. We've got like 6 minutes left. We wanted to talk about docs with respect to the 1.6 release. So I went through our docs page and I searched for all the words I could think of related to networking, and I pulled out what I thought were the important docs. I sent them to the mailing list today, or sent to on the agenda thread. There was a couple in there that when I reread them was like, oh, those are not right. But I count at least 8 significant docs that we own. And I opened them all and I read them all, and most of them, okay, all of them need at least a little bit of work, and some of them need complete overhauls. So I sent off a note to our internal docs people who are spearheading a big revamp of the docs site right now, and asked them, like, what do you want us to do? And the answer that I got was probably not to fix these docs in place, but instead to take the content of the docs and break them up into the new structure of documentation that they're working on, which is tasks, tutorials, and concepts. And they have template docs for these things. And so if we're going to spend time cleaning up our docs in 1.6, we should perhaps invite somebody from the docs SIG to explain to us the meaning of these 3 different templates and how to correctly apply them.
Yeah, and that sounds reasonable. I took a look at all those docs too, and my general impression was that the things that deal with services were actually pretty good, and which may be completely wrong, but the docs that dealt with the kind of the lower level networking stuff, networking plugins, network policy, and the general networking thing could probably use a much larger overhaul than the services docs.
Yes. What I found with services was that services was out of date. There was a bunch of stuff that was missing. But the biggest problem was all of these docs read like engineering docs.
Yep.
Or encyclopedias. And which does not make for great user-facing documentation, right? So I only got the response from the docs people while we were in this meeting. So I would actually propose in the last few minutes here that we don't go off and assign docs to people yet, that we instead invite them to join us next week, our next session, and explain to us the 3 classes of documentation that they're working on, and then we break it up into who wants to take on various facets of these docs. Because I don't think assigning one doc to one person is going to be the right mapping in the end.
Sounds good to me.
I agree. What were those 3 headers you mentioned?
Tasks, tutorials, and concepts.
Cool. Yeah, my biggest takeaway from trying to read the docs was what the heck are all these titles at the top supposed to mean, and what goes in what? Because so that's promising.
Well, I'll take the action item to get one of the docs people to join us next time. We'll give them the first, say, 15 or 20 minutes to explain and maybe show us some of the examples of these 3 styles of docs that they've been working on. And then we can take the existing docs that we've identified here and any others that people find. Please do go hunting. and break those up into these sorts of headings that we want to do. Cool?
Yep.
All right. Any other agenda items?
Well, there was multi-tenant DNS, but we only have 3 minutes for that.
Yeah, I mean, if you just want to quickly answer my comment that I made, I don't know if this is the right SIG where this belongs because it's kind of cross-cutting, but essentially it's most applicable to the multi-tenant scenario where you're trying to divide up your cluster by namespace and have DNS policies where namespaces don't interact with each other or even share the information. Because you can technically do this with a network policy, but there's still the information leak.
I think this is the right SIG, although there's going to be some crossover to the, what SIG is David driving this under? Is it Lifecycle?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Anyway, one of the guys here has just started spinning up some more research into multi-tenancy proper, and I'm not sure which SIG he's actually operating under the auspices of, but I think definitely it affects us.
I thought that at the last KubeCon, we agreed that multi-tenancy would be headed up in SIG auth.
Is it SIG auth? Okay, that makes sense. Thank you for remembering. So multi-tenant DNS is definitely on the radar for the multi-tenancy discussion. If you want to move it forwards in the discussion, like we want to talk about it in a smaller sense, maybe we can put that on the agenda for next time, unfortunately.
No, that sounds great. We have a proposal that maybe I'll just try to put in the proposal section and then maybe gather some more feedback before next meeting.
Okay. All right. Okay, then, if there's no other issues, I guess we will regroup in 2 weeks.
Sounds good.
Yep.
Thanks all.
Thanks everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.